At 72, Josephine Caldwell was thrown off the porch of the only home she'd ever known, clutching nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a crumbling century-old deed. They thought they had destroyed her. Instead, they handed her the keys to an empire hidden beneath the dirt. The morning of October 14th was crisp, the kind of autumn day in upstate New York that usually brought Josephine Caldwell a profound sense of peace. For 40 years, she had woken up at dawn to tend to the sprawling apple orchards of Willow Creek Farm. But on this particular morning, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway did not belong to the usual farmhands. It was a sleek black Mercedes SUV, and the people stepping out of it were there to tear her life apart. Her nephew, Thomas Wentworth, adjusted his designer tie as he walked up the porch steps, refusing to meet her eyes. Beside him was his wife, Camilla, a corporate real estate lawyer whose sharp, predatory smile made Josephine's blood run cold. Behind them stood Sheriff Gregory Boyd, looking deeply uncomfortable, holding a manila folder thick with court orders. "Aunt Josie," Thomas began, his voice tight and rehearsed, "you know why we're here. The probate judge made his ruling yesterday. The transition period is over." Josephine's hands trembled as she gripped the wooden railing she and her late husband David had built with their own hands. When David passed away 10 years ago, the farm had legally transitioned into a complex family trust, a trust managed primarily by David's estranged brother, who recently died and left his controlling shares to his son, Thomas. Josephine had always been assured via verbal promises and family loyalty that she would live out her days on the farm. But Camilla had found a loophole in the 1980s paperwork, a clause regarding tenancy at sufferance. They were liquidating Willow Creek to a commercial developer for a multi-million-dollar payout, and Josephine was in the way. "You're throwing me out," Josephine said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried over the silent orchard. "I planted these trees, Thomas. I changed your diapers in that living room. You're doing this for a payout?" "It's just business, Aunt Josie," Camilla interjected, smoothly stepping forward with the eviction notice. "We gave you 30 days to vacate. We are officially taking possession of the property. You have 1 hour to gather whatever personal effects fit in your truck. Everything else is now property of the estate. The cruelty of it was absolute." At 72, Josephine watched Sheriff Boyd apologetically oversee her removal. She packed a single duffel bag of clothes, a box of old photographs, and David's weathered leather satchel, holding their most important documents. By noon, she was sitting in the cab of her beat-up 1998 Ford F-150, overwatching in the rearview mirror as Camilla changed the padlocks on the front door of her home. That night, Josephine sat on the lumpy mattress of room at the Starlight Motel, a cheap roadside inn off Interstate 81. The silence of the room was deafening. She had less than $2,000 to her name. Her pension was entirely tied up in the farm's frozen accounts, currently hostage in Camilla's ongoing legal maneuvers. She was homeless, exhausted, and feeling the heavy, crushing weight of her age. Seeking some comfort, she opened David's leather satchel, tracing her fingers over old anniversary cards and faded bank statements. At the very bottom, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, was a folded, yellowing document. It was a deed. Decades ago, Josephine's great-uncle Gideon Miller, an eccentric and reclusive man who distrusted banks and society alike, had left her a piece of land in his will. David had always laughed about it, calling it Gideon's Folly. It was a 40-acre plot of unincorporated off-grid scrubland in the rugged foothills of Montana, legally named Ironclad Ridge. They had never visited it. The tax was a mere $30 a year, which David had set up to pay automatically. With nowhere else to go, no family left to trust, and a fierce, burning pride that refused to let her end up in a state-run nursing facility, Josephine made a desperate choice. She wasn't going to fade away in a motel room. It took her 4 grueling days of driving across the country to reach Montana. When she finally turned off the county highway onto the neglected dirt path leading to Ironclad Ridge, her heart sank. The land was a desolate, overgrown wasteland. Dead skeletal ash trees clawed at the gray sky. The soil was choked with thick, thorny brambles and jagged limestone rocks. In the center of the property, sat a rusted, dilapidated 1974 Airstream Sovereign trailer, half sunken into the mud, its windows cracked and covered in years of grime. It looked less like a sanctuary and more like a graveyard. Josephine stepped out of her truck. The biting November wind cut right through her wool coat. She stood alone in the barren wilderness staring at the rusted Airstream. For the first time since the eviction, she fell to her knees in the dirt and wept. They had won. Clear's throat. Thomas and Camilla had stripped her of her dignity and exiled her to a wasteland. But as her tears soaked into the dry Montana earth, a different emotion began to take root. A stubborn, fiery spark. She wiped her face, smearing dirt across her wrinkled cheeks. She was a farmer. She knew how to survive the dirt. Surviving the first month at Ironclad Ridge tested the very limits of Josephine's endurance. The Airstream, while structurally sound, was a freezing metal tin can. She spent her dwindling cash on a heavy-duty sleeping bag, a propane space heater, and basic provisions from a hardware store 2 towns over. She hauled water from a small muddy creek at the edge of the property, boiling it over a camp stove. The physical labor was agonizing. Every morning, Josephine woke up with her joints screaming in pain, her hands blistered and raw, but she refused to stop. Armed with a machete, a heavy iron shovel, and a rusty wheelbarrow she found behind the Airstream, she began hand-clearing the suffocating brambles around her immediate living area. She worked with a frantic, quiet rage, channeling every ounce of her betrayal into the swinging of the blade. By mid-December, the winter frost had hardened the ground, making the work nearly impossible. One evening, her burner phone buzzed. It was a text message from Thomas. "Heard you went to that garbage dump in Montana. Camilla's firm is willing to offer you $5,000 for the deed to clear up the family records. Use it to put yourself in a decent retirement home. Don't be stubborn, Josie. You're going to freeze to death out there." Josephine stared at the glowing screen in the dim light of the Airstream. $5,000? A calculated insult designed to break her spirit completely. She didn't reply. Instead, she powered the phone off, shoved it into a drawer, and went to sleep with a renewed, ferocious resolve. She would rather die on her own 2 feet in the freezing mud than take a penny of their charity. The next morning, Josephine targeted a particularly dense cluster of thorny locust trees that had grown around a strange, unnatural mound of earth near the northern boundary of the property. She needed to dig a fire pit to burn the massive pile of brush she had accumulated, and this elevated spot seemed safe. She drove her shovel into the frozen earth. It barely dented the topsoil. She brought it down again, putting her entire body weight behind the heavy iron tool. Clang. The sharp, metallic sound echoed through the silent dead trees. The impact sent a painful, jarring shock up Josephine's arms, nearly dislocating her shoulder. She stumbled back, gasping, holding her aching wrists. Frowning, she knelt in the dirt. It wasn't the dull thud of a limestone rock. She brushed away the top layer of frozen mud with her gloved hands. Beneath the dirt, she saw the edge of something unnatural. It was concrete. Not just a block, but a poured, smooth slab. For the next 4 hours, Josephine forgot about the freezing temperature. She dug like a woman possessed, clearing away decades of overgrown roots, mud, and debris. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Montana sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, she finally stepped back, exhausted and breathless, to look at what she had uncovered. It was a heavy, rusted iron cellar door set deeply into a concrete plinth, completely flush with the ground, and hidden beneath years of overgrowth. It was secured by a massive oxidized steel padlock. Why would Uncle Gideon, a man who lived a life of absolute frugality, build an underground bunker in the middle of nowhere? Josephine practically ran back to the Airstream, ignoring the screaming pain in her knees. She grabbed a 3F crowbar she had bought for leverage and hurried back to the iron doors. She wedged the crowbar into the loop of the rusted padlock. She strained, the veins bulging in her neck, gritting her teeth against the resistance. With a sharp, sudden crack, the old rusted shackle snapped. She tossed the broken lock aside, gripped the iron handle of the door, and pulled. It groaned in protest, a terrible shrieking sound of metal scraping metal. but it slowly gave way, falling backward with a heavy thud. A stale, dry gust of air rushed out from the darkness below. Josephine clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight and aimed the beam down into the earth. There was a set of concrete stairs leading down into a small cinder-block room. It wasn't a bunker, and it wasn't empty. Josephine descended the steps carefully. The room was surprisingly dry, completely sealed off from the moisture of the earth above. In the center of the room sat a heavy wooden table. On it rested two objects that would alter the course of her life forever: a thick leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth and a heavy brass-bound lockbox. With trembling hands, Josephine unwrapped the journal. The pages were yellowed, filled with Uncle Gideon's erratic, sharp handwriting. She flipped to the first page. It read, "To whoever finds this, preferably of my blood, the world is a thief. They will take your money, your home, and your pride, but they cannot take what the earth hides. I bought Ironclad Ridge not for the dirt above, but for the veins below. The green gold." Josephine frowned, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The green gold!" She turned her attention to the brass-bound lockbox. The key was taped to the bottom of the journal. She slid it into the lock and turned. It clicked open smoothly despite its age. When Josephine lifted the lid, the beam of her flashlight caught a reflection that made her gasp aloud. The box wasn't filled with gold bars or cash. It was packed to the brim with incredibly detailed hand-drawn topographical maps, geological surveys stamped from the 1950s, and at the very bottom, a velvet pouch. She pulled the pouch out and loosened the drawstrings, spilling its contents into her calloused, blistered palm. Dozens of rough, uncut gemstones tumbled into her hand, glowing with a deep, mesmerizing cornflower blue fire in the beam of her flashlight. They were Yogo sapphires, some of the rarest, most flawless, and most valuable precious stones in world, found only in a highly specific localized vein in Montana. And according to the map spread out on the table, the largest entirely untouched subterranean vein of them ran directly beneath the 40 acres of Ironclad Ridge. Uncle Gideon had found it, mined a handful, and hidden the truth, terrified that the government or corporations would seize his land. Josephine stood in the silent underground room, the blue stones glittering in her palm. The freezing cold was gone. The exhaustion was gone. Camilla and Thomas had thrown her away to die in a barren wasteland. Instead, they had unknowingly banished her to a throne of hidden wealth. A slow, deliberate smile spread across Josephine's weathered face. The real work and the real revenge was just about to begin. The morning after her discovery, Josephine did not rush out to shout her victory to the world. She was a farmer, and a farmer knew that a seed exposed too early to the frost would wither and die. She needed capital. She needed secrecy. And above all, she needed to protect Ironclad Ridge from the vultures who had already picked her life clean once. Her first move was strategic and discreet. She packed 5 of the smallest, unpolished Yogo sapphires into a velvet pouch and drove 6 hours to Billings, Montana. She bypassed the flashy commercial jewelers and parked her rusting Ford F-150 in front of an unassuming, highly secure brick building, Croft & Sons Independent Gemology. Nathaniel Croft, a third-generation gemologist and certified appraiser for the Gemological Institute of America, GIA, adjusted his jeweler's loop as he examined the rough stones. The silence in his office stretched for 10 agonizing minutes. Finally, he set the loop down, his eyes wide with restrained shock. "Mrs. Caldwell," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "these are untreated, unheated, flawless Yogos. The cornflower blue color is absolute perfection. Stones of this clarity and uniform saturation haven't been pulled from the earth since the English mine closed in the 1920s. Where did you get these?" "They are a family inheritance," Josephine replied smoothly, her expression unreadable. "And there are more. But I need a broker who values discretion as much as a percentage." Nathaniel agreed immediately. Within a week, he had privately auctioned the 5 small stones to an elite European collector. Josephine walked out of the bank with a cashier's check for $285,000. She didn't buy a luxury car or check into a penthouse. She went back to the dirt. Josephine established an impenetrable blind trust, Gideon's Shield LLC, to legally mask her ownership and financial activities. Then she began to move with the precise, calculated force of a military general. She hired two local brothers, Caleb and Wyatt, both former copper miners who had been laid off and were desperate for quiet, well-paying work. Under the guise of digging a massive foundation for a new farmhouse and an underground root cellar, they brought in the heavy machinery, a Kubota KX0404 compact excavator, and a heavy-duty John Deere 5275E tractor. While the locals thought an eccentric old woman was just aggressively landscaping her scrubland, Caleb and Wyatt were actually excavating the subterranean vein Uncle Gideon had mapped out. The deeper they dug beneath the limestone, the more the earth yielded its treasures. The vein was incredibly rich. Every week Josephine sent a new secured shipment to Nathaniel Croft. Her bank account swelled into the millions, but Josephine knew that immense wealth on paper was a target. If Camilla and Thomas ever investigated her, they would see the financial anomaly and strike. She needed the perfect cover. She needed to make Ironclad Ridge look like a legitimate, wildly successful agricultural venture. She funneled her gem wealth into transforming the barren wasteland. Over the next 4 months, the 40 acres underwent a miraculous metamorphosis. Josephine brought in convoys of trucks carrying nutrient-rich topsoil to bury the jagged rocks. She installed a state-of-the-art Tesla solar roof array and an advanced geothermal heating system to make the property entirely self-sufficient. The rusted 1974 Airstream was hauled away, replaced by a breathtaking custom-built cedar log home from Caribou Creek Log Homes, featuring wraparound porches and floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows overlooking the valley. But her true masterpiece was the agriculture. She constructed 3 massive climate-controlled hydroponic greenhouses. Inside, she cultivated high-yield organic heirloom tomatoes, rare culinary mushrooms, and cold-hardy saffron crocus, selling them at a premium to Michelin-starred restaurants across the Pacific Northwest under her LLC. To the outside world, Josephine Caldwell had simply struck it rich through high-end niche farming. By late April, exactly 6 months after she had been thrown off her porch in New York, Ironclad Ridge was no longer a wasteland. It was a thriving emerald paradise blooming in the rugged Montana foothills, but across the country in New York, a shadow was looming. Camilla Wentworth, sitting in her sleek Manhattan corner office, was a woman driven by control and paranoia. During a routine audit of the Willow Creek Trust, a junior paralegal flagged a bizarre anomaly. Josephine Caldwell's state tax records showed she had paid off the back taxes on her Montana property not with a paltry Social Security check, but through a highly capitalized corporate entity, Gideon's Shield LLC. Curious and inherently suspicious of anyone finding success she couldn't siphon, Camilla hired a private investigator in Billings. A week later, the investigator's drone photographs landed on her mahogany desk. Camilla stared at the glossy photos in disbelief. There were massive solar arrays, luxury cedar cabins, and commercial-grade greenhouses. It was a multi-million-dollar estate. "She stole from us," Thomas hissed, looking over Camilla's shoulder at the photos. "She must have known about a hidden account in the Willow Creek Trust before we pushed her out. She embezzled our money to build this." Camilla's predatory smile returned. Not for long. The original eviction mandate included a clause that any assets she took from the estate are subject to immediate forfeiture. "We're going to Montana Thomas. We're going to take her paradise." June 12th dawned with a brilliant, piercing clarity. The Montana sky stretched out in a vast, unbroken canopy of deep azure that perfectly mirrored the flawless sapphires resting securely in Josephine's underground vault. The air was warm, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp, rich soil. Josephine was kneeling in the humid sanctuary of her greenhouse, carefully pruning a row of vibrant green heirloom tomato vines, when the perimeter alarm on her property gate chimed softly on her smartphone. She wiped the dark, nutrient-rich soil from her hands and pulled up the live feed from the high-definition security cameras. A sleek black Lincoln Navigator was aggressively tailgating a local fertilizer delivery truck, slipping through the automated iron gates before they could close. Josephine sighed unhurriedly, untied her denim apron, and poured herself a tall glass of iced tea from the cooler. She had been expecting them for weeks. When the Navigator crunched to a halt on the pristine gravel driveway, Thomas and Camilla stepped out accompanied by a sharp-suited, aggressive-looking corporate attorney from Billings named Bradley Carmichael. For a long, silent minute, the trio stood paralyzed, gaping at the staggering beauty of the estate. The dead skeletal ash trees were gone, replaced by thriving rows of blossoming, cold-hardy apple trees. The rusted airstream had been swallowed by history, replaced by a multi-million-dollar cedar log mansion. It was a breathtaking, self-sufficient paradise. "Aunt Josie," Thomas called out, breaking the silence. His voice was loud, dripping with a condescending mock sympathy as Josephine stepped out onto her sweeping wraparound porch. "Well, you certainly have been busy out here in the wilderness." "This is private property, Thomas," Josephine said calmly, leaning against the polished wooden railing and taking a slow sip of her tea. "You are trespassing on a federally registered agricultural site." Camilla recovered from her shock, her designer heels clicking sharply against the cedar deck as she marched up the steps. She slapped a thick, heavily bound legal injunction onto the patio table. Her signature predatory smile was firmly in place. "Save the tough girl act, Josephine," Camilla sneered, tapping the legal document with a manicured fingernail. "We know exactly what you did. We found the anomaly in the tax records. You drained a hidden contingency fund from the Willow Creek just days before the probate judge finalized your eviction. You used our family's money to build this little luxury retirement resort." Bradley Carmichael stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "Mrs. Caldwell, this injunction grants my client's immediate preliminary seizure of Gideon's Shield LLC and all associated physical assets pending a federal embezzlement investigation. If you do not vacate the premises within the hour and hand over all financial access, we will involve the county sheriff to execute an arrest warrant for grand larceny." Josephine looked at the thick legal document, then up at Camilla's triumphant, vicious face. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She didn't even blink. Instead, she laughed. It was a deep, rich, unrestrained laugh that echoed across the quiet valley, startling a flock of ravens from the nearby pines. "You always were a brilliant real estate lawyer, Camilla," Josephine said, shaking her head in genuine amusement. "But you are an absolutely terrible chess player." Josephine reached into the pocket of her flannel shirt and pulled out a small, heavy, velvet box. She tossed it onto the table. It landed with a solid thud next to the injunction. "Open it!" Josephine commanded, her voice suddenly dropping its warmth, replacing it with cold, unyielding authority. Frowning, Thomas reached out and slipped the lid open. He gasped, dropping the box onto the cedar planks. A massive 15-carat, flawlessly cut Yogo sapphire, the crown jewel of Uncle Gideon's subterranean vein, sat nestled in the white silk. In the bright Montana sunlight, it radiated a blinding, fiery blue light that seemed almost unnatural. "What? What is this?" Camilla stammered, her eyes locked onto the gemstone. "That," Josephine said, stepping closer, "is an unheated, flawless Yogo sapphire. It was mined directly from the bedrock beneath your designer shoes. I didn't steal a single dime from your precious trust, Camilla. I didn't have to. I own the largest, most profitable, unmined sapphire vein in North America. My LLC is a registered, federally compliant mining operation. My wealth came from the dirt you exiled me to." Camilla's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing without sound. That's impossible. The odds. "Oh, it's very possible," Josephine continued, towering over the younger woman. "And because I didn't steal your money, your little injunction is entirely worthless. But since we are on the topic of grand larceny, let's talk about stealing, shall we?" Josephine pulled a sleek tablet from the table drawer and tapped the screen, turning it to face them. "When I made my first million from the raw stones, I didn't just build greenhouses," Josephine whispered, her eyes locked onto Camilla's panicked face. "I hired KPMG, one of the top forensic accounting firms in the world. I paid them handsomely to quietly audit the 10 years of management fees you and Thomas extracted from the Willow Creek Trust before you evicted me." Josephine swiped the screen, displaying a series of highlighted bank transfers. $850,000 diverted to a shell corporation in Delaware. $1.2 million in falsified equipment depreciation costs, $2.4 million siphoned directly from David's protected pension fund into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Thomas stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He grabbed the railing for support. "And Josie, wait, we can explain. I submitted that 200-page forensic audit to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division 3 weeks ago," Josephine interrupted, her voice ringing with absolute finality. As if summoned by her words, the crunch of heavy tires echoed down the long driveway. 3 dark SUVs with government plates rolled aggressively through the open gates, completely blocking the Lincoln Navigator. A local sheriff's cruiser pulled up right behind them, its lights flashing silently in the bright afternoon sun. Camilla's arrogant facade shattered completely. She looked around wildly like a trapped animal, but there was nowhere to run. The vast, beautiful landscape of iron-clad ridge suddenly felt like an inescapable prison. "You ruined my life for a payout," Josephine said quietly, watching as federal agents in tactical windbreakers began to step out of their vehicles. "You thought throwing me into the dirt would bury me. You forgot that dirt is where I do my best work." Thomas began to sob hysterically, sinking to his knees on the beautiful cedar porch. Camilla stood frozen in shock as she was forcefully handcuffed, read her Miranda rights by an impassive FBI agent, and marched down the stairs. Bradley Carmichael, the aggressive Billings lawyer, had already retreated to his car, desperately making phone calls to distance his firm from the radioactive couple. Josephine didn't stay to watch them get shoved into the back of the federal vehicles. She had a farm to run. She picked up her glass of iced tea, turned her back on the flashing lights, and walked out toward her sprawling, sunlit greenhouses. The air was crisp, the soil was rich, and beneath her boots, the earth held enough blue fire to outlast them all. She had lost her home only to forge an empire from the forgotten earth, and this time nobody would ever take it away. If Josephine's incredible journey from a betrayed widow to the queen of her own sapphire empire inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button. Her story proves that sometimes being pushed to rock bottom is exactly what you need to uncover the treasure hidden beneath. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to rebuild, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life tales of revenge, resilience, and hidden fortunes.